So you want to start saving money and you start researching online on what to do. Well, you're going to be hit with a bunch of different advice around building an emergency fund. And unfortunately, if you listen to a lot of the YouTube gurus, they will tell you possibly to forego building an emergency fund and just start investing. And today we're going to be talking about what is an emergency fund and should you build an emergency fund? Where should you put the assets inside of an emergency fund? And also, should you build an emergency fund or is it more important to focus on investing? And we're going to talk about all of that. So let's go ahead and get started talking about what exactly is an emergency fund. And an emergency fund is almost exactly what it sounds like. Something comes up that we need to pay for, and generally this happens where it's something that's unexpected, maybe a leaky roof or something we need to fix on our car or our tire blows out, whatever it might be. There's often times where we have unexpected expenses that we need to come out of pocket for. And if you've been paying attention at all over the last couple of years, I don't think I need to sell you out on the idea that oftentimes crisis happens and we've got to be able to respond to those things. It seems like that's been happening every couple weeks for the last few years. And if you look at a lot of the statistics or a lot of what happened to people, there were quite a few people who had lost their jobs, and now coming into 2023, we're seeing that a lot of people are losing their jobs again. So what does this mean for most people? Well, if they don't have a set of cash or something where they can get money from, they are then obviously going to have to borrow some of that money to take care of the bills that they have. This usually means that they're going to have to get some kind of credit card or some kind of loan that's going to then cost them interest. So not only are they going to have to pay for the emergency, but if they're not prepared for it, they also have to pay for the costs of borrowing that money, which if it's a credit card could be maybe even 20%. So there's a 20% penalty for having an emergency if you're not prepared for it, which then means that they can't prepare in time for the next emergency, meaning they end up in this cycle over and over and over again. And you may have felt this yourself, where you feel like you're just getting out of the last crisis, you're just about whole, maybe you've even started saving some money, and then something happens, you have to get back into debt again, and you just repeat this sucker cycle over and over and over again. And a lot of this has been happening in the US, and you've probably seen a ton of articles about this, where the average American, almost 50% of them, don't even have $400 saved in case of an emergency. So it's not far-fetched to say this impacts many, many people. And the impact is not just financial, the impact is also psychological. Because when we are having challenges with money, it affects other areas of our life. It affects relationships, it affects our stress levels, it affects our health, because we don't normally operate well when we live in high stress situations for a long period of time. Now, the common objection that I usually get when it comes to building an emergency fund is people say, well, shouldn't I start investing first? Because you just taught me about compounding interest. It's the ability for those assets to grow over time. So obviously, the more time that we have and the more assets that we have to put in there, the more that can grow. And your logic is absolutely correct on this. The challenge is, if you listen to some of these YouTubers and financial experts that tell you that it's dumb to build an emergency fund and you should really start working on your investing first, there are some challenges that come with that. And now personally, I've been in the industry for over 10 years. I've helped educate thousands of people as far as clients and students goes. So I have seen just about everything, and I've put together my own poll, which is just from watching people's experience. The challenge of the people who want to skip this step of actually saving for an emergency fund gets them into a lot of trouble, because when you start to invest in things, or for the vast majority of people that are investing, they generally have a crisis alongside of having a crisis financially. Meaning when they need that money, it's because there's massive layoffs going on. And when massive layoffs are going on, it's generally because stuff is happening in the stock market as well. People aren't confident about businesses that are laying off lots of people. So that usually means that their investments are also down. So just kind of like having to borrow on the credit card and that 20% penalty for borrowing on a credit card and having to pay it back. The same thing can happen, but on the opposite side with their investment. Maybe their investment is down 20 or 30%, and so now they've got to liquidate that asset, which means they realize that loss, and now it's a 20 or 30% penalty out of their investment for needing the money now for an emergency. And if you really weren't thinking about it and you had it in your 401k or your IRA, the government is going to put an additional 10% tax penalty on it as well. So it can be a huge penalty for not having an emergency fund ready to go. And you can obviously see how this gets pretty bad pretty fast. Whereas if you actually take the advice of building an emergency fund instead of your investments first, it allows you the options to make decisions, because you don't always want to have to sell your investment at that particular time. But if you don't have an emergency fund, you have no real options. And if you've ever been in that situation before, or I can tell you from my personal experience, for some reason, when you're in a situation where you have to have money, you don't have much negotiation power when you're trying to sell things, which means you oftentimes have to sell it for less than you could even get for it because you're in a hurry to do so. Whereas on the opposite side, when you're not in a hurry to sell something and you're selling it simply because you don't really need it, there's oftentimes you can get more than you may have wanted for it, or at least get what you had wanted for it because you have time. And this can even be true when the markets are going up. It's not always when the market's down. Sometimes if the market's on an upward trend, you may not want to have to get out yet. There still could be an opportunity cost in having to get out too early. So again, having options gives you a better chance of financial success. This is also true when it comes to the psychology of money. Again, going back to having options. So when you have an emergency fund, you have the ability to make better decisions for your own life. If you talk to people like I do, I'm sure you've talked to many of them who don't really like their job. They don't really feel appreciated from their boss. Maybe they're not even getting paid the value of what they could be doing somewhere else in the marketplace, but they're stuck at that job simply because they have no options. Now, if we had an emergency fund, it gives us the ability to maybe quit our job, or maybe start that business we've been wanting to do. Whatever it might be, having a liquid or having a place where emergency fund has easy access to of 3 to 6 months, it gives people the ability to stand up for what they actually believe in. And so maybe that means leaving that job or moving to a different area, or maybe just taking time off to be with your kids or your spouse while they're going through a tough situation. The challenge is, again, if we don't have that emergency fund, we don't have the options to be able to do the things that we need to do. But this kind of leads to another question. How much is enough to have an emergency fund? And the challenging part is there's no right answer for everybody. There are different risk tolerances and people who feel differently about this. But in the past, one of the things that we used to do, or was kind of an easy way for you to figure this out for yourself, is we look at kind of the worst case scenario. And for most people, that would be losing their job. Now, it used to be that most people could replace their job, or the idea of an emergency fund was about 3 months, maybe extended out to 6 months on the high side. The challenge of what's happened over the last few years, it has been harder to find newer jobs or to find a high-paying job. So if you make more money than the average person, it can take you longer to find a job, and people have been out of work longer. So we might actually need to extend that closer to maybe 6 to 12 months, or at least that's what I recommend doing if you have the ability to be able to do it. But we also don't want to have too much money sitting in the emergency fund because it's not growing. It means that we have a loss of an opportunity cost. So for instance, if you make $100,000 a year and you have $200,000 sitting in a bank account, there's probably going to be some opportunities that you're losing there in order to be able to purchase a home, invest, put into your retirement program. So you're missing a lot of opportunity for things to be able to grow over time. You're missing out on that compounding interest. So that's not good either. And finding that position between maybe half a year's salary all the way to a year's salary of being saved. And it technically doesn't even need to be that much, because if you were to start your business or be let go, you're probably not going to be going out to the club as much. You're not going to be doing a lot of the frivolous stuff. So you could look at what is your base expenses? What does it cost to live if you were to cut back a little bit for 6 to 12 months while you're figuring out whatever it is you need to figure out? What would those actual expenses be? And you could have that set aside for your 6 to 12 months of expenses inside of your emergency fund. And imagine the difference in the psychological feeling of having 6 to 12 months of income set aside. Do you think you could make some different decisions about where you work? Do you think you could go to the marketplace and look for another job? Do you think you could maybe kick off that business that you've kind of been procrastinating? Maybe you've been working on the background, you figured out how to make some money, but now it really requires some time for it to take off. Do you think if you had 12 months of expenses set aside in an emergency fund, you could venture into doing something like that? And so that's what having an emergency fund gives you, is options. So that leads us into another question. Where should you have your emergency fund? Where should you put it? And now the number one requirement for emergency fund is easy access and no real penalty to get to it. You want something that you have the ability to get when you need it. So you could look at maybe a high yield savings account, or you could also maybe look at something like structuring some CDs so you can get an even better rate of return. And the reason for that is because you need to outpace inflation. And now, if you don't understand inflation, all you have to do is go talk to your grandfather or grandmother and just ask them how much it costs them to go to the movies and get a thing of popcorn and some soda. And if your parents, grandparents, or anything like mine, or when I had asked them these conversations, they could go to the movies and for 10 cents, they would see the movie for them and their girlfriend, their spouse, and they could also get some popcorn and some soda, and it was like 10 cents, right? You've heard those old whippersnapper conversations with your grandparents, right? But now, try to go to the movies on $10. You probably can't even get in the door for most theaters. So the difference in cost over time is what we're talking about with inflation. So if you have the ability to get some sort of rate of return and meet those other requirements of liquidity and not having a penalty for getting towards it, then you can look at some of those options as well. Because we would like to not lose money while it's sitting in an emergency fund. And now, as we talk about the major conflict that people have with trying to decide, should I ignore the emergency fund and just go invest? Or do I need to build my emergency fund first before I go and invest? And the reasoning behind this is they go, well, I could really grow my investment so much faster. And if we were to run some numbers, you would be absolutely correct. If we were putting away $200 a month at an average of 8 or 9% rate of return, that 1 year of loss is going to be tens of thousands of dollars. So people look at that and go, wow, I'm going to lose $10, $20, $30,000 of this growing over the next 60, 70 years, of this growing over the next 40 years, and maybe want to skip out on doing an emergency fund. And the challenge is your logic is 100% accurate. You would have more money in your account if you were to start investing now. But the challenge is reality. And I've seen lots of people try to do this. They try to skip that step of building an emergency fund in order to try to get to the investing part faster. The challenge is it almost never works out. Look at what's going on now with crypto and a lot of these other issues that we're having with people who are trying to skip the basic steps to swing for the fence, to hit the lottery, if you will. Now, some people did very, very well, but the vast majority of people lost almost everything. And that's just kind of how that goes. For a lot of these people who had their money and stuff like that, not only did they lose the money, not only are they going to have an emergency with everything that's going on, but they also haven't built an emergency fund. So they're getting hit on every single angle. And unfortunately, and I feel bad for them, but this happens more often than you would probably think. And it's simply because they're trying to skip steps. And instead of having an emergency fund that would be pouring water on the fire, because they had it in a very unsecure investment, and now they will probably also have to take a loan. They're basically pouring gasoline on the situation instead of water. And it's so easy to have a little bit of money set aside for this. And I'll show you some ways to make it happen even faster. Now, if you're still with me, I want to give you some shortcuts and some easy ways to make this happen faster than you probably think that it could. And part of that is going to be automating this system, that every time you get your paycheck, every time that you make some money, you want to be automating that it's going to be putting some money into your emergency fund. Now, it's important that it goes there and stays there. It doesn't count if you put $200 in and pull it back out. That's not actually save you, okay? So find out how much you can put into there a month, and you start moving that over. Now, some shortcuts on how you can make that happen even faster. Obviously, you can cut out some of the frivolous things. Now, this is easier said than done, but sometimes if you really look at your budget and you're willing to go through that, you can find a lot of things that you're spending money on that you don't even use anymore, especially coming out of COVID. There's probably subscriptions that you signed up for that you don't use anymore because you're back to work, you have things going on. There's probably a lot of stuff that you barely use that it's not really even worth the money that you're spending on it that could help fast forward this. So if you're willing to look through your budget, I'll bet you can find a couple $100 that will expedite this process even faster. But let's say you've already done that, and because of inflation and everything going up, that your budget is pretty tight. Here's a couple things that you can do that will help with that as well. One of them is you can look at rounding up your budget. So what I mean by that is, let's say it costs you $42 to fill up your tank. You could round that in your budget to $50. So when you go fill up your tank, costs you around $42, you automatically put that difference into that savings account as well. So you have your dedicated amount every time your paycheck comes through, but then every time you purchase things and you've rounded that up, you move that difference into that savings account as well. And you will be really surprised how fast you can actually build up your emergency fund. Now, how do we tackle the idea of also being able to invest? Because for most people to save an entire year's income or even 6 months worth of income could take a long time, at least a year or 6 months, right? Probably 2 or 3 times longer than that. So part of the strategy here is that you keep the bulk of it, or you figure out how much you can save. Let's say it's $500 a month that you can put into your emergency fund. You don't really have much going anywhere else. That $500 a month you can dedicate purely into savings. So you put that $500 a month after month, some of that additional savings. Maybe you get there a little bit faster than you expect to, but you get 1 to maybe 3 months or 2 months, 1 or 2 months that's set aside into that emergency fund. Well, now you can start dialing that into a little bit longer term, because now you're pretty comfortable if you've never had 1 to 2 months of income set aside. Well, now you've got a decent pile where maybe all 500 doesn't have to go in there. Maybe you can take 10% or 20%, so maybe $50 or $100, and now you have $400 a month going into your emergency fund and $100 now going into something that's longer term that you can start investing for the long haul. So $100 a month into something more of a long-term investment and $400 a month here. Now, maybe as you hit 3, 4, 5 months, you start dialing that a little bit more. And maybe now you're putting 40% here and you're putting 60% here. So $200 there, $300 here. And you're building up that ability of your emergency fund, but you're also able to capitalize on the investing. And what you'll find while you're doing this is there's tons of extra money that comes in that we don't think about. Well, when you're talking about your taxes and you get a tax return, there's $1,500 or $1,000 there. All of a sudden you swipe that into your emergency fund, you go, man, I'm ahead of the game. I didn't expect to be here. Because when you're looking for savings, you find more of it. When you're looking at expenses and you're looking at debt, you find more of that too. So the focus here is to be looking for more things that you can save. And when your brain is attuned to that, you will find more ways to save. So if you're willing to follow this advice, the next time you come into emergency, you're going to have a ton more options. You're going to be much more psychologically stable, which means when your emotions are not out of control, you make better decisions as well. So there's so many plus sides to having an emergency fund that you won't even understand or comprehend until you've built one and you actually need to use it. Your life is so much more peaceful and you get to start living life on your own terms. You're definitely not able to do whatever you want to do at this point, but you start getting a taste of freedom and options. And once you have that, it's hard to break that cycle because good decisions lead to better outcomes. And I hope this was helpful for you. If it was, make sure you smash the like button and also hit the subscribe and the bell as well. We've got a ton of additional content coming out that's around helping you do better in your life, especially when it comes to money and finances. And I'm a huge advocate for financial literacy. I think that when people are literate about how money works and what to expect when it comes to returns and how money should operate and what a good investment looks like, I think the only way to understand that is to become financially literate. And when you become more financially literate, you make better decisions with money. It's just how it works. So if you feel like you're not financially literate, and most people are not, you can look down below and I have a link to where we can schedule a call and I can help you understand where you're at in some of your situations and send you a book at no cost to you. I will pay for it. Or if you're not quite ready for that, there's even a link down below that where you can get some of the chapters in the book for free so you can start learning more about how money works. And as always, I hope this was helpful and I'll catch you guys later. Bye.